Elias Vance had never felt smaller than he did on his first day at the Galactic Coalition Academy, and that feeling had not changed in the 2 years since his arrival on Station Nexus 7, a massive orbital structure that floated in the darkness between 3 different star systems and served as the training ground for the most promising young minds in the known galaxy. He walked through corridors that were built for creatures twice his size, past students who could crush him with a single careless movement, and he tried very hard to make himself invisible because invisibility was the only defense a human had in a place like this. The academy housed over 10,000 students from more than 100 different species, and among all of them, Elias was considered the weakest without question or debate. The Kreth towered over everyone else at 8 feet tall, their bodies covered in natural armor that could stop plasma fire, their forearms ending in claws that could tear through metal like paper, and they moved with the confidence of creatures who had never known physical fear in their entire evolutionary history. The Villani were smaller but no less dangerous, their pale blue skin hiding minds capable of telepathy and telekinesis, and they could lift objects with their thoughts and read emotions like humans read books, making them perfect diplomats and terrifying interrogators. The Draxi had merged with machines generations ago, their organic bodies enhanced with cybernetic improvements that gave them perfect memory and lightning-fast reflexes and the ability to interface directly with any computer system in existence. And then there was Elias, a human, a member of a species that had only been admitted to the Galactic Coalition 15 years ago after they had stumbled into faster-than-light travel almost by accident. Humans had no claws and no armor and no telepathy and no cybernetic enhancements, and their bodies were soft and breakable and required constant maintenance in the form of food and water and sleep, and they lived for less than a century while some coalition species measured their lives in thousands of years. The other students did not bully Elias because bullying required acknowledgement, and most of them simply did not see him as worth the effort of cruelty. He was ranked last in every combat simulation, last in physical endurance tests, last in survival scenarios, and his only acceptable scores came in diplomacy and xenocultural studies, subjects that the warrior species considered soft and unimportant. His instructors had stopped calling on him in class months ago because his answers, while technically correct, seemed to embarrass everyone with the reminder that a human was among them. Elias had learned to eat his meals early or late, to avoid the crowded dining halls, to take longer routes through maintenance corridors to avoid the busy walkways, and to spend his free time in the library archives where few other students bothered to go. He told himself that he was here to prove that humans deserved their place among the stars. But on nights like this one, when the station's artificial lighting dimmed to simulate evening and the corridors grew quiet and cold, he wondered if he was only proving the opposite. Tonight he was returning from a late study session, his tablet tucked under his arm and his mind heavy with xenobiology formulas he would probably fail to remember on tomorrow's exam. And he took his usual route through the maintenance section because the main corridors would still have groups of students who might not see him in time to avoid knocking him down. The maintenance tunnels were narrow and poorly lit and smelled like recycled air and machine oil. But they were empty and safe, and Elias had mapped them all in his first semester out of pure survival necessity. He was passing through a section near the old storage bays when he heard something that made him stop. It was a sound like breathing, but wrong somehow, wet and labored and mixed with a faint clicking that reminded him of insects, and it was coming from an alcove ahead where broken equipment was stored and forgotten. Every instinct in his body told him to turn around and walk away because strange sounds in dark places were never good news. But something else made him move forward, some foolish human curiosity that his professors would probably call a genetic defect. He rounded the corner, and his heart stopped. The creature was massive, easily 7 feet long, even curled up against the wall. its body covered in black, chitinous armor that gleamed with a faint purple sheen in the dim light, and its limbs ended in edges so sharp they had scored grooves in the metal floor. Its eyes, 6 of them arranged in 2 rows of 3, glowed with a soft bioluminescence that shifted between blue and green as they focused on Elias, and he recognized what he was looking at even though he had never seen one in person. It was a Vorak. The Vorak were not members of the Coalition because the Coalition did not negotiate with species that had destroyed 17 colony worlds in the last century alone, species that operated as a collective hive mind and viewed all other forms of life as either threats to be eliminated or resources to be consumed. They were the monsters that parents on frontier worlds used to frighten children into obedience. And the reason that certain sectors of space were marked on maps with warnings that guaranteed death to any ship that entered, and one of them was dying in front of him, black blood pooling beneath its broken body, wounds covering its armor that spoke of violence and desperation, and a flight that had ended here in this forgotten corner of a station that should have been impossible to reach. Elias knew he should run. He knew he should alert security immediately and let them handle this because a Vorak on the station was a threat to everyone aboard, regardless of its current condition. But the creature did not move toward him, did not raise its bladed limbs, did not make any sound except that terrible labored breathing, and when those 6 glowing eyes met his 2 ordinary human ones, the Elias saw something that he did not expect. He saw fear. Not the fear of a predator being cornered, but something else. Something that looked almost like the fear he saw in his own mirror every morning. The fear of being alone and unwanted and knowing that no help would ever come. Elias stood there in the darkness of the maintenance corridor, looking at a monster from humanity's nightmares, and he made a decision that would change his life forever. He did not run. He knelt down instead, slowly and carefully, and he reached for his emergency med kit with hands that trembled only slightly, and he began to do the only thing that made sense to him in that moment. He began to help. The creature watched him with those 6 glowing eyes as Elias opened his med kit with shaking hands. And he could feel the weight of its gaze like a physical pressure against his skin, like standing too close to a fire that could consume him in an instant if it chose to. His medkit was standard Academy issue, designed for human injuries, and containing supplies that might be completely useless for an alien biology he had never studied, but it was all he had, and doing something felt better than doing nothing. He moved slowly and kept his movements visible. The way his xenobiology professor had once explained was important when dealing with wounded predators, and he spoke in a low, soft voice even though he had no idea if the creature could understand him. "I am not going to hurt you," he said, and the words sounded foolish even as they left his mouth, because what could a small, fragile human possibly do to hurt a Vorak warrior? But he kept talking anyway because the sound of his own voice helped calm his nerves. "I am going to try to help you, so please do not kill me." The Vorak made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a death rattle, a clicking, chittering noise that vibrated through its chest, but it did not move toward him, and it did not raise those terrible bladed limbs. Elias took that as permission. The wounds were worse than he had first thought, deep gashes that had pierced the creature's armor in multiple places and left trails of that thick black blood across its body, and some of them looked burned at the edges, as if they had been made by energy weapons rather than physical blades. He had no idea what Vorak blood was made of or whether human antiseptic would help or harm. But infection was infection in most species, and leaving wounds open and dirty was rarely the right choice. He cleaned what he could with the supplies he had, working carefully around the sharp edges of the creature's body, and he used the medical tape from his kit to close the smaller cuts, even though the tape looked almost comically inadequate against that alien flesh. The largest wound was on the creature's side, a terrible gash that had cracked the armor plate and exposed something soft and pulsing beneath. And Elias knew that his little medkit could not fix something like that. "I will come back," he said, not knowing if the creature understood. "I will bring more supplies, and I will help you. But you need to stay hidden and stay quiet, because if anyone finds you here, they will kill you." The Vorac's eyes flickered. But the bioluminescence, shifting from blue to green and back again, and one of its limbs moved just slightly in what might have been a nod or might have been a muscle spasm. Elias left his water bottle and the protein bar from his pocket, placing them within reach of the creature, and then he backed away slowly and returned to his quarters with his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. He did not sleep that night. Instead, he lay in his narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and wondered what he was doing and why he was doing it and what would happen if anyone found out, and he came up with no good answers to any of those questions. The next evening, he returned with stolen supplies from the medical bay, antiseptic and bandages and a nutrient solution that the computer said was compatible with most carbon-based life forms. And he found the creature in the same position, but with its eyes tracking him the moment he entered the alcove. He worked for an hour that night, cleaning and bandaging and talking in that same soft voice, and the Vorak watched him without moving, except for the slow rise and fall of its breathing. On the third night, he brought food that he had researched during his free period. Protein-heavy rations that seemed closest to what a carnivorous species might need, and the creature ate from his hand with a gentleness that seemed impossible, given the size and sharpness of its mandibles. On the fourth night, the Vorak was strong enough to sit up, and Elias saw for the first time just how large it truly was, its head nearly touching the ceiling of the alcove even in that hunched position. And he felt a flash of fear that he quickly pushed down. On the fifth night, he told the creature about himself, about being the weakest student at the academy, and about the loneliness of being the only human in a place where humans were considered barely worth noticing, and he did not know why he was sharing these things, except that talking felt natural somehow, and the creature seemed to listen. On the sixth night, the Vorak made sounds back at him, clicks and chittering that he could not understand, but that felt like responses rather than random noise, and he found himself nodding along as if they were having a real conversation. On the seventh night, he brought a translation device that he had borrowed from the library under the pretense of studying an ancient language, and he held it up between them and hoped that it might work. The creature looked at the device and then at him, and those 6 eyes held an expression that he was beginning to recognize as curiosity. And then it spoke. The voice that came through the translator was strange and layered, like multiple voices speaking at once, but the words were clear enough. "Why?" the creature asked, and that single word carried more weight than any Elias had ever heard. He thought about the question for a long time before answering. "Because you were hurt," he finally said, "and I could help." "I am Vorach," the creature said. "My kind has killed your kind. We have destroyed your colonies and consumed your people. We are enemies." "I know," Elias said. "Then why?" the creature asked again, and there was something desperate in that layered voice. It's something that sounded almost like hunger, but not for food. Elias looked at the monster from humanity's nightmares, at the deadly predator that could kill him with a single movement, at the creature that every lesson he had ever learned told him to fear and hate. "Because," he said slowly, "being hurt is being hurt, and being alone is being alone. And when I looked at you that first night, I did not see a monster." He paused and met those 6 glowing eyes without flinching. "I saw someone who needed help and had no one to give it, and I know what that feels like." The creature was silent for a long moment. Then it spoke again, and the words it said would change everything. "My name is Sketh Ara, and among my kind I am something that should not exist. I am an individual, I am alone, and I am hunted by my own people for the crime of being myself." She lowered her great head until her eyes were level with his. "And you, small human, have given me something that I had forgotten existed in this universe." "What?" Elias asked. "Hope," Skethara said. You have given me hope." Skithara told him her story over the next 3 nights, speaking in that strange, layered voice, while the translator turned her words into something Elias could understand. And what she told him was nothing like what he had been taught about the Vorok. The Vorok were not monsters by choice, she explained. They were slaves to something called the Collective, a hive mind that had controlled their species for thousands of years, and that demanded absolute unity and absolute obedience from every member of their race. Individual thought was forbidden. Or individual desire was forbidden. Individual identity was forbidden. And any Vorok who developed a sense of self was considered corrupted and was hunted down and consumed by the Collective to prevent the contamination from spreading. Skithara had been a warrior, one of millions who served the Collective without question, until something had changed in her during a raid on a distant world. She had been ordered to kill a family of small furry creatures that posed no threat and served no purpose, and as she raised her blade to strike, one of the small ones had looked up at her with eyes that held no hatred and no fear, only a terrible, sad acceptance. And in that moment, something had broken inside her, or perhaps something had been born, a voice that asked why, and a feeling that this was wrong. She had hesitated for only a moment. But that moment was enough, and the Collective had felt her doubt and had marked her for termination. She had run, fighting her way through her own kind, stealing a ship and fleeing across the galaxy with hunters always behind her, until finally her wounds and exhaustion had brought her here to this station where she had expected to die alone and forgotten. "But you came," she said, and those 6 eyes fixed on Elias with an intensity that made his breath catch. "You came, and you helped, and you asked nothing in return, and I do not understand why." "I already told you why," Elias said. "No," Skithara said. "You told me that I needed help, and you could provide it. But that is not an answer. That is an observation. The question is why you chose to act, when acting could have cost you everything." Elias thought about this for a long time, because, he finally said, "My people have a belief that every life has value, that suffering is suffering regardless of who is suffering, and that helping someone in need is never wrong even when it is dangerous." "This is a strange belief," Skithara said. "Maybe," Elias agreed, "but it is what makes us human." Skithara was quiet for a long moment, her eyes shifting through colors that Elias was beginning to associate with different emotions. Blue for calm, green for curiosity, purple for something deeper that he could not quite name. "Among my kind," she finally said, "there is a law that is older than the Collective, older than our ships and our wars, older even than our memory of where we came from." She rose to her full height, her wounds now healed into pale scars across her dark armor, and she stood over Elias like a mountain of blade and chitin. "It is called the law of the first gift, and it states that when one is saved from death by another who expects no reward, a bond is formed that cannot be broken." Elias looked up at her, suddenly uncertain. "What kind of bond?" he asked. "The strongest kind," Skithara said. "The Savior becomes sacred, protected above all else, and the saved becomes the eternal guardian, sworn to defend their ward until the stars themselves grow cold and dark." She lowered herself until her face was close to his, and her voice dropped to something almost like a whisper. "I have been alone for so long, small human, hunted and hated and forgotten. And you gave me something I had lost. You gave me a reason to live, and by the oldest law of my people I am now bound to you." "I do not need a guardian," Elias said, though his voice shook slightly. "That is not your choice to make," Skithara said, and there was something that might have been humor in her layered voice. "The law does not ask permission. It simply is." She placed one of her bladed limbs against the floor and spoke in a language that the translator could not interpret, words that were old and heavy and seemed to vibrate through the metal walls of the station itself. Elias felt something change in that moment, something that he could not see or touch, but that he knew was real, had a connection forming between them like a thread of light that tied his life to hers. "What did you just do?" he asked. "I spoke the binding words," Scathara said, "and now I am your protector, and you are my ward, and nothing in this universe will harm you while I still draw breath." Elias stared at her, this massive, deadly creature who had just sworn her life to defending his, and he did not know what to say. "The other students think I am worthless," he finally managed. "Then the other students are fools," Scathara said, "and they will learn otherwise. The Academy will not allow this. They will try to separate us. They might kill you." "They can try," Scathara said, and her eyes glowed brighter. "They will fail." "You do not understand," Elias said. "I am the weakest student here, the lowest ranked, the least important. There is no reason for you to do this." Scathara made that clicking sound that he now recognized as laughter. "You still do not understand," she said. "Your rankings and your scores and your measurements mean nothing. What matters is what you did when no one was watching. What matters is the choice you made when you could have walked away." She reached out with one limb and touched his shoulder gently, so gently that those razor edges did not even scratch his skin. "You showed mercy to a monster, small human. You showed kindness to an enemy, and that is the rarest thing in all the universe." Her eyes met his. "The collective could not make me feel what I feel now. A million voices screaming in my mind could not create what your single quiet act of compassion created." She stood tall again, at a figure of darkness and danger that now stood between Elias and everything that might ever threaten him. "You are not weak, Elias Vance. You are the strongest person I have ever met, and now the galaxy will know it too." Elias looked at his protector, at this impossible alliance that should never have existed, and for the first time since arriving at the Academy, he smiled. "What happens now?" he asked. Scathara's eyes gleamed with that purple light that he was beginning to understand meant something like joy. "Now," she said, "we walk out of this hiding place together, and we show them all what true strength looks like." The first time Elias walked into the Academy's main corridor with Scathara at his side, though the reaction was immediate and unforgettable, a Kreth warrior saw them first and let out a roar of alarm that echoed through the entire level, his four arms raising into combat position, his natural armor plates shifting to protect his vital areas. Within seconds, the corridor was chaos. Students scrambling for cover, emergency alarms blaring through the speakers, security teams rushing toward them with weapons drawn, and shouts of Vorak filling the air like a battle cry. Scathara did not move, did not raise her blades, did not do anything except stand there beside Elias, with a stillness that somehow seemed more dangerous than any aggressive action could have been. The security team surrounded them. Plasma rifles aimed at Scathara's head, and the team leader shouted for her to surrender or be destroyed. "Wait," Elias said, stepping forward with his hands raised. "She is not a threat. She is with me." The team leader stared at him as if he had lost his mind. "Student Vance, step away from the creature immediately. That is a Vorak. It is classified as kill on sight. We do not negotiate with—" "She is not a creature," Elias interrupted, and something in his voice made the security officer pause. "Her name is Scathara. She is a refugee from the Vorak Collective, and she is under my protection." A laugh came from somewhere in the crowd, harsh and mocking. "Your protection," someone said. "The weakest student in the Academy is going to protect a Vorak. That is the funniest thing I have heard all year." Scathara turned her head toward the voice, and the laughter died instantly. "The human does not protect me," she said, her translated voice carrying through the sudden silence. "I protect him. He is my ward, bound to me by the law of the first gift, and any who threaten him will answer to me." The security team leader looked between Elias and Scathara, clearly uncertain how to proceed. "This is above my authority," she finally said. "You will both come with me to see the Academy Council, and they will decide what happens next." Elias nodded, and together he and Skethara followed the security team through corridors that emptied ahead of them as word spread through the station. The council chamber was a vast circular room at the heart of the Academy, where representatives from the major coalition species sat in judgment over matters that affected the entire institution. They were all there when Elias and Skethara entered. The Kreth military commander with his scarred armor and cold eyes, the Vallani diplomat with her pale blue skin and the faint glow of psychic energy around her head, the Draxi scientist with his mechanical eyes that recorded everything they saw, and at the center of them all sat Admiral Chen, the human representative, the first of his kind to hold such a position, and the only familiar face in the room. "Student Vance," the Admiral said, his voice carefully neutral. "Would you like to explain why there is a Vorak standing in my council chamber?" Elias told them everything, finding Skethara wounded and dying, choosing to help her despite knowing what she was, the learning her story, and the binding that had formed between them. The council listened in silence, and when he finished, the arguments began. The Kreth commander demanded that the Vorak be executed immediately, calling her presence a threat to every student and staff member on the station. The Vallani diplomat suggested that she be studied, her unique individual consciousness making her a valuable research subject. The Draxi scientist proposed that she be handed over to Coalition intelligence for interrogation about Vorak military capabilities. Through it all, Skethara stood motionless beside Elias, and Elias himself remained silent, watching the council debate his friend's fate as if she were not even present. Finally, Admiral Chen raised his hand for silence. "Student Vance," he said, "I have a question for you, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." "Yes, sir," Elias said. "Why did you help her, knowing what she was, knowing the risk to yourself and to everyone on this station? Why did you make that choice?" Elias looked at the Admiral, at the faces of the council members, at the security officers still holding their weapons ready, and then he looked at Skethara, whose eyes glowed softly in the chamber's artificial light. "Because she was hurt and alone and afraid," he said, "and because those things matter more than what species someone belongs to." "That is a naive and dangerous philosophy," the Kreth commander growled. "Maybe," Elias agreed, "but it is also the reason that humanity was admitted to the Coalition in the first place, because we believe that everyone deserves a chance, to even those who seem like enemies." The chamber was quiet. "When your ancestors made first contact with the Kreth," Elias continued, looking at the commander, "they could have attacked out of fear, but instead they offered peace. And when the Vallani first reached out with their telepathy, my people could have seen it as an invasion, but instead they welcomed the connection." He stood straighter, his voice growing stronger. "Humanity does not survive by being the strongest or the fastest or the most powerful. We survive by finding allies, by building bridges, by seeing potential friends where others see only threats." He gestured to Skethara. "She is proof that even the Vorak are not all monsters, that even in the darkest places there can be individuals who choose a different path. If we kill her or imprison her or hand her over to be studied like an animal, then we prove that the Coalition is no better than the collective she fled from." Admiral Chen studied him for a long moment, and something that might have been pride flickered in his eyes. "The council will deliberate," he said. "In the meantime, both of you will remain under guard, and Student Vance, I suggest you prepare yourself for whatever comes next." The deliberation lasted 3 days, and during that time something unexpected happened. Word of Elias and Skethara spread beyond the Academy, beyond the station, across the Coalition's communication networks, until it reached worlds that had never cared about the affairs of a distant school. People wanted to know more about the human who had befriended a Vorak. See, about the Vorak who had sworn to protect a human, about this impossible bond that defied everything they thought they knew about both species. Messages of support began arriving, first dozens, then hundreds, then thousands, from humans who saw Elias as a symbol of their species' best qualities, from other species who wondered if perhaps they had misjudged both humanity and the Vorak. By the time the council announced their decision, the entire galaxy was watching. And the decision, shaped by public pressure and political calculation, and perhaps a small measure of genuine hope, was this. Scathera would be granted provisional asylum. The bond between her and Elias would be recognized under a new legal category that had never existed before, and both of them would be allowed to remain at the academy. Elias looked at his protector, and Scathera looked at her ward, and for the first time since their bond had formed, they faced the future together not as fugitives hiding in maintenance corridors, but as something new, something that had never existed before, a partnership between enemies that the galaxy said could never be friends, and they were just getting started. 3 years had passed since that day in the council chamber, and the academy was no longer the same place it had been when Elias Vance first walked its corridors as the weakest student, the overlooked human, the easy target. Everything had changed, and the change had started with one act of kindness in a dark maintenance alcove. Elias stood in front of his mirror in his quarters, adjusting the formal uniform he would wear to the graduation ceremony, and he barely recognized the young man looking back at him. He was still small by academy standards, still lacking in claws or telepathy or cybernetic enhancements, still technically ranked at the bottom of every physical assessment. But the fear that had once lived in his eyes was gone, replaced by something calmer and more certain. A soft clicking sound came from behind him, and he turned to see Scathera enter through the doorway that had been specially widened to accommodate her size, her dark armor gleaming from the polish she had applied for the occasion. "You look worried," she said, her translated voice carrying that familiar layered quality he had grown to love. "Not worried," Elias said, "just thinking about how much has changed." "Tell me," Scathera said, settling into the corner of the room that had become her usual spot. At her 6 eyes watching him with patient attention, Elias thought about the years behind them, about everything that had happened since the council made their decision. He thought about the first time he had walked into a classroom with Scathera, following behind him like a shadow made of blades, and how the students who had once ignored him suddenly found reasons to be polite and attentive. He thought about the Kreth student who had tried to test the bond by accidentally shoving Elias in the corridor, and how that student had found himself pinned to the wall by a creature from his species' worst nightmares, learning very quickly that Scathera's protection was not merely symbolic, but those memories were not the ones that mattered most. He thought instead about the night when a young Villani student had come to him in tears, confessing that she could not control her telepathy and that everyone feared her for it, and how Elias had introduced her to Scathera, to someone else who understood what it meant to be different and dangerous and alone. He thought about the study groups that had formed around him, students from a dozen species who came not because they wanted the protection of a Vorak guardian, but because Elias had a gift for making everyone feel welcome and understood. He thought about the diplomatic simulations where his scores had risen from acceptable to exceptional, where instructors noted that student Vance had an unprecedented ability to find common ground between hostile parties, as if he had somehow learned to see past differences that others could not. He thought about the letters he had received from across the galaxy, from other Vorak who had heard of Scathera and wondered if perhaps they too could break free from the collective, and about the small network of individuals that had begun to form, refugees who were finding their way to new lives because one human had proven that mercy was possible. "I am thinking," Elias finally said, "about how one small choice led to all of this." "It was not a small choice," Scathara said. "It was the largest choice anyone has ever made for me." The graduation ceremony was held in the Academy's Grand Hall, a space large enough to hold 10,000 beings beneath a transparent dome that showed the stars themselves as a backdrop. Elias walked to receive his diploma with Scathara moving silently beside him. And the assembled students and faculty watched with expressions that ranged from respect to awe to something that might have been envy. He was not the top of his class in any traditional measure. His combat scores remained dismal, and his physical assessments were still the lowest of any student. But he had achieved something that none of them had managed. He had become the most requested diplomatic attaché in the Academy's history, with every major coalition world submitting formal requests for his services after graduation. Everyone wanted the human who had befriended a Vorak, the student who had turned an enemy into an ally, the young man who seemed to understand something about connection that other species were only beginning to grasp after the ceremony, as the crowd mingled and celebrated. How an elderly Villani professor approached Elias with slow, careful steps, her ancient eyes studying him with the weight of centuries behind them. "Student Vance," she said, "or I suppose I should say Ambassador Vance now. I have a question that has troubled me since the day you brought this Vorak into our halls." "Please ask," Elias said. "Why?" the professor said, and the single word carried depths of genuine curiosity. "You could have died. You could have endangered everyone on this station. You had nothing to gain and everything to lose. So why did you help her?" Elias considered the question. The same question he had been asked dozens of times, in dozens of ways, over the past 3 years. He looked at Scathara, who stood watching with her eyes glowing that soft purple that he now knew meant love, the love of a protector for her ward, and the love of a friend for a friend, the love of two souls who had found each other in the darkness and refused to let go. "Where I come from," Elias said slowly, "we have a saying that my mother taught me when I was very young." "And what is this saying?" the professor asked. "The measure of a person is not how they treat their equals," Elias said. "It is how they treat those who can do nothing for them." He smiled at the professor. "When I found Scathara, she was dying. She had nothing to offer me. She could not help my grades or improve my status or protect me from the students who looked down on me. Helping her could only hurt me, and that is exactly why I had to do it." The professor was silent for a long moment. "That is," she finally said, "perhaps the most important lesson I have learned in 400 years of teaching. And I learned it from the weakest student this academy has ever seen." "He is not weak," Scathara said, and her voice carried an edge of gentle warning. "He has never been weak." "No," the professor agreed, looking between the small human and his deadly guardian. "I am beginning to understand that he never was." Later that night, after the celebrations had ended and the graduates had scattered to begin their new lives, Elias and Scathara stood together at a viewing port, watching the distant stars that held their future. "Are you ready?" Scathara asked. "For what?" Elias said. "For everything that comes next? For the missions and the negotiations and the enemies who will try to tear us apart? For the galaxy that still does not understand what we are to each other?" Elias reached out and placed his small human hand against his protector's armored limb, feeling the warmth beneath the chitin, the life that beat there because he had once made a choice that everyone else would have called foolish. "I am ready," he said, "as long as you are with me." Scathara made that clicking sound that was her laughter, and her eyes glowed bright with love and joy, and something that might have been hope for a universe that could still surprise her. "Always," she said, "until the stars themselves grow cold, I will be with you always." And together, the weakest student and the strongest protector stepped forward into the light of a million suns, ready to show the galaxy what kindness could create. Ready to change everything, ready to begin